place to start off when talking about the topic of learning and memory is how they're differentiated. And I want to bring this up. This is for academic reasons. It's not necessarily, in popular. It's just how we view them when we're doing research. So I want to differentiate what we mean by the difference between learning and memory. Okay. In psychology, when we talk about learning, we're talking about an increase or decrease in a behavior of some type. Okay. So, the typical example, you do something right, someone rewards you, so you're more likely to do that in the future, that kind of reinforcement idea. So that's learning. Okay. Knowledge is more what we're doing in this class. This is more memorization. It's more memory stuff. So when we talk about classwork in the area of psychology, we're usually referring to some memory or cognitive task. But when we're talking about learning, we're talking about a change in behavior. Okay. And if you remember from the beginning of the class, we talked about a concept called behaviorism. And behaviorism dominated American psychology for much of the 20th century. It dominated the last century for about a good 50 to 60 years. Okay. Because what behaviorists felt is that psychology was losing its footing. It felt like it was becoming more of a philosophy. And so these individuals wanted to make psychology more like the natural or physical sciences. And in the natural and physical sciences, the thing that we study are those things we can observe in the environment and the responses of it. Okay. So when we're talking about behaviorism and we're talking about learning, anything beyond the environment and the response of the organism, anything in between there does not matter to a behaviorist. So thought processes, emotions, feelings are all what they consider byproducts of the stimulus response association. Okay. And so it's an important point to make because you won't hear in behaviorism any more emotional terms or how it made you feel or anything like that. It's about a stimulus and a response and a consequence of that response. Okay. And maybe the best place, well, let's introduce a few people so that we know that what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about three types of learning. The first one is classical conditioning. And classical conditioning is learning that takes place because there's an association between objects. Okay. So for example, if you have a dog that doesn't like the vet, okay, it's not the vet that they don't like. It's not going. It's the association of the shots and the things that happen in the vet's office that are being associated. Okay, operant conditioning is what you typically think about, like when you're trying to teach your kids something or something like that. Operant conditioning relies on someone to operate, meaning there's a behavior. So we have a stimulus, a response, and then we have a consequence to that response. Okay. If that consequence is rewarding, the probability of that behavior increasing in the future is increased. If that consequence is punishing, that decreases the probability that we'll do that in the future. Okay. And then the last thing that we're going to talk about is social learning. Social learning is the idea that we can learn from observing others. Okay. Now, what's truly unique about human social learning versus other species social learnings is humans can observe a lot of people doing the same thing and then pick and choose what behaviors they're going to take on to accomplish that same task. Okay. So let's say a cooking example, let's say, mom makes menudo, grandma makes menudo, aunt makes menudo. You watch them all, they all do it slightly different, but you're not necessarily going to mimic one. You're going to take on what you like about each of them and then probably make your own menudo. Okay. That's different from other species. Other species cannot make so well, let me give you a basic example. A wolf learning to hunt. Okay. The wolf isn't going to be able to watch mom and how mom hunts, and then dad and how dad hunts, and then aunt and the aunt hunts, and then come up with their own unique way of hunting. No, what they do is they usually observe the primary parent, which is usually the mother, and they mimic their behavior. Okay. So what we see in other animals isn't necessarily social learning, it's called mimicking behavior. Okay. So that's kind of the difference kind of between humans and what we observe in other species. All right. So kind of a fun way to kind of introduce this is through this short video. But I need to make sure that I did the sound right. So let's watch a kind of a cute little video that kind of shows kind of what we're going to be talking about.
Okay, so Kim, the night manager, went on maternity leave.
All right. So that's kind of a funny way to
Okay.
say this is kind of where we're going with this learning stuff that we're talking about. And if you noticed in that case, that was a example of operant conditioning where Penny was rewarded for doing what Sheldon felt was the appropriate behavior, which we'll talk about in a little while. But first, I want to talk about really the differences and make it more defined, the difference between when we're talking about classical conditioning versus operant conditioning. Okay. So classical conditioning is what we call associative learning. Okay. And it really, most of the time, doesn't require the actions of the individual to have the learning occur. Okay. So in this case, our stimulus one is a doctor's office, which in and of itself doesn't produce any anxiety or stress. But stimulus two, which is a shot, which can be painful and threatening, then naturally increases a person's a threat. And eventually what happens is without the stimulus, the doctor's office becomes a scary place. Okay, that's associative learning. Probably my best example of associative learning, and I think it's a really good example because it happened over 20 years ago, I think like 2002, I believe, is a doctor put me on a new medication. And that medication made me really, really, really sick. I mean, sick. But that night, after starting to take that medication, I went out and had some fettuccine Alfredo, and it happened to be when I was eating the dinner is when the sickness came on. It was the onset. Okay, so even though it was the medication that created the sickness, ever since then, and it's been 20 years, I have not been able to smell or even have the idea of eating fettuccine Alfredo without gagging or getting sick. Okay. But it was just that association from getting very sick with a pill and what I was eating at the time I became sick. And that's what associative learning is. Okay. Operant conditioning is what we often think of when we're working with our children, training our pets, making, cleaning up our boyfriends, those kind of things. And it has to do with a person commits some behavior, operates, okay? And that behavior is either rewarded, which increases the probability that they'll do it again, or it's punished, which decreases the probability that they'll do it again. Okay. So in this case, the girl swims, she does really good, so she gets rewarded for it, which increases the probability that she will swim good next time. Okay. So this is really what we're talking about over the next couple classes. And by the end of this, you'll learn how to train your animals and your kids and your boyfriends and girlfriends to get them how you want them to be. Just kidding, but we'll see what happens. Okay. So let's first talk about the classical conditioning. The person that is famous for classical conditioning is a physiologist named Ivan Pavlov, who was doing much of his work in the old Russian Republic at the time. And it's kind of interesting. Ivan Pavlov is an interesting person because what he was actually doing is investigating the digestive system. That's what his expertise was in. It's what he is trained in. So it's interesting that we talk about him in psychology classes when, maybe we should also be talking about him because he was one of the first to look into things like antacids and ulcers and all those kinds of things, but he's known for classical conditioning. Because at the time, what he was doing is he was measuring the salivation response to dogs based on the intensity of smell of a food, okay? And the way he did this is he surgically put a little vial into one of the salivation glands of the dog, which measures the amount of salivation the dog produces. And then in the original experiments, they would give food with different intensities of smell, okay? And just to see what the salivation response was. But as kind of the legend goes, one day Pavlov was watching and he recognized that the dog salivated without the presence of any food. And he started to notice that it was whenever one of the feeders, one of the experimenters that usually gave them the food, walked into the room. And it started with hearing the footsteps of the experimenter coming towards the dog that created the salivation. And he, thought this was very irregular because, you shouldn't have salivation without the presence of the stimulus that produces it, okay? And so he set up a series of experiments, and his famous one deals with a bell, okay? But there's some terminology that we should talk about. He termed food which naturally creates salivation, okay? He calls this an unconditioned stimulus. So an unconditioned stimulus is anything that will naturally produce some type of behavior or process in an organism. So an unconditioned stimulus like food creates an unconditioned response in the animal. So food will naturally elicit salivation. It doesn't require any learning. It doesn't require anything like that. It happens because of that stimulus, okay? A neutral stimulus is something that doesn't produce that given response. We know a bell produces a response and sometimes a startle response, but it doesn't create salivation, okay? We call the bell in the beginning a neutral stimulus, okay? Then which produces non-salivation response or no response, okay? Then in Pavlov's experiment, he paired the bell with the presentation of the food. So the animal was given the food, the bell would ring. the food, the bell would ring. Gave him the food, the bell would ring. Gave him the food, the bell would ring. Okay. And of course, because we have the unconditioned stimulus, the dog would salivate. Okay. But then after pairing these two several times, Pavlov would just ring the bell and bam, it would create the salivation in the dog. Okay. Which means, so this is the example of associative learning. Okay. Probably where this became big. So let's talk about associative learning and give it some application for a few minutes. If you go into a what's called cognitive behavioral therapy for, say, addiction or for depression, okay, one of the things that they talk about is identifying triggers. Okay, a trigger is something that will create a depressive process, or in the example of addiction, a trigger is something that will initiate cravings to, for example, drink alcohol. Okay, basically, triggers in this situation are conditioned stimuli that produce a conditioned response, which is craving. Because those triggers have been paired, in this case with alcohol, over and over and over, that the trigger itself creates the craving or creates the depressive episode. Okay. Things like phobias are a good example of classical conditioning. And this comes out of famous research by John B. Watson. Watson is what's known as a father of behaviorism. He wrote the Behavioral Manifesto that said we're not going to study that thing called the mind anymore. What we're going to study is the association between stimulus and response. And one of the things he wanted to prove is that phobias, fear, is conditioned in an individual. So he did a little experiment on a little baby called little Albert. Little Albert was about 6 weeks old or so at the time, because what Watson wanted is he didn't want any prior learning to interfere with the experiment. And what Watson did is he paired a little white rat or little white bunny with a loud banging noise. And eventually what happened is that little Albert became scared of the little white rat and everything without the need of the stimulus. So the way that worked out goes something like this. Oops.
To prove that environment is more powerful than genetics, Watson designs an experiment for an infant known as Little Albert. He's so confident, he films it for posterity. At first, Albert shows little fear, even when Watson places a burning newspaper in front of him. Albert is also unafraid when he encounters a white rat for the first time in his life. But then Watson shows Albert the rat accompanied by a loud clanging noise. One of the few things that upsets little Albert. And he does it again. And does it again. Eventually, Albert learns to fear not just the rat, but all furry things, even without the loud noise. In Watson's mind, the Little Albert experiment is a success because it proves that fears are learned, not inherited.
All right, I will just mention really quickly, don't worry, those kinds of experiments would not be allowed anymore. But what did we learn from the little Albert experiments became important because they were replicated with animal models and others, is that um, fear in and of itself is largely a learned behavior. It's a learned thing. Okay. Now, the unfortunate parts, and I'll talk about Watson just a little bit. The unfortunate parts about Watson is that they never did what's called counter conditioning. When this is when you do exposure over time with the conditioned stimulus, and the response goes away, the conditioned response goes away. And so we don't know what happened with little Albert and his fears of soft white animals and whatnot. Some theories say that he actually died at a very young age. We just don't know. But the reason why no one ever went back and worked with little Albert is because at the time of that experiment, Watson was having an affair with his graduate assistant Rainier, and you saw Rainier in that video. And the university came to him and said, either you break off your affair with your assistant, and you can stay working here, or you give us your resignation. Okay. I feel really bad for Watson's spouse, because what he chose is to leave university, and he divorced his wife, married Rainier. We'll talk about this later when we get into intimate relationships. One of the things that we do know is that intimate relationships can stay long lasting, because he did stay committed and in a very loving relationship with Rainier until his dying day. In fact, the rumor goes is that Rainier died 10 years earlier than him, and he spent the last 10 years kind of locked in his house in a depressive stupor. So, but we'll talk about more things like that when we get to relationships here in a week or two. But what other things Watson had a big influence on using this associative type of learning and stuff is he had a very successful career in marketing. Okay. Because what he found and what he, promoted is, I believe the first company that hired him was a coffee company, and they were seeing a decrease in their product sales. And back then, it was a belief that if you wanted to increase purchases, you have to increase the quality of product you put out. Okay, and Watson disagreed with that. What he said is what you need to do is make your product more appealing. So what he did is he took their regular can of coffee grounds, and then he took another one and he made it look really, really fancy and shiny. Okay. Same product, but the one in the fancy can sold 4 or 5 times more than the one in the regular can. Okay. And so he made a lot of money on just dressing up a product. Okay. And it's an example of associative learning, because we associate quality with packaging, with how nice it looks. Okay. I think my best example is macaroni and cheese. If we think about Kraft versus, the off brands, a lot of people will say, oh, the Kraft is much, much better. Even though, and I even think that, even though if you look on the back of the generic versus the Kraft, they actually come from the exact same factories most of the time. And so same product in both containers, different labeling. And even as the consumer, we think it tastes better. Okay. So he was very successful in that end. And he also wrote some parenting books based on classical conditioning. And if you had a parent who was really into reward and punishment on everything, that probably came from a lot of the writings in the early rearing parenting books from John B. Watson. Okay. But I want to go through, so that's just some examples of the use of classical conditioning into marketing and into other areas of life. I want to go through the phases of classical conditioning, okay? The acquisition phase is when the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus are paired together. This is where the learning is taking place, the association between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, okay? Now, if the conditioned stimulus after they've been paired together is only presented, okay, so only this is presented, eventually what happens is the behavior becomes extinct, okay? In order for this continued learning to occur, you have to pair that unconditioned stimulus every once in a while, okay? But if we just give the conditioned stimulus, then the behavior will go extinct. You'll no longer respond to that anymore, okay? I just said the example of fear and example of the acquisition of, again, you know, pairing that loud noise with a white furry animal created the response of fear to the animal. So that animal was the conditioned stimulus. The unconditioned stimulus was the loud baying. The response was a fear response, okay? Now, what we know is if we were able to just continually exposing little Albert to the little white animal without the loud bang, eventually little Albert would have extinguished his fear of little white animals, okay? This is probably the hallmark of what's called exposure therapy. And it's the #1 treatment for people who have severe phobias, okay? Now, it's a little bit different because you got to condition each little thing out of the individual. So let's say a person has a snake phobia, and it's really severe, okay? Well, in doing an extinction or a exposure therapy, you just don't put a person in a room with a bunch of snakes. No, usually what you do is you start with the person seeing pictures of snakes, and you wait for their physiology to even out. So you continue exposing them to pictures, and then you expose them to imagining snakes, okay? And then you expose them to having snakes in another room with the door closed. And then you have the door open. And then you have them in the room with the snakes, but the snakes are in a cage. And then you have the person in with the snakes with no barriers. And you do it very progressively. And that's what exposure therapy is. And it's really probably one of our most effective therapies we have for treatments of something. But that's called the extinction phase, okay? However, an interesting thing that happens is if there's a rest period, so there's no exposure to the conditioned stimulus, there's no more pairing, but then one day, all of a sudden, the person sees a snake. They can have a spontaneous recovery response without any pairing, okay? Probably the best example of this is in studies of relationships, right? So you're with someone, you meet someone new, they're the conditioned stimulus. The unconditioned stimulus is the feelings of, oh, they're so cute, oh, they're so nice. So all of this association is being made. So then we have this, right? We have this association. But then, you know, the end of the honeymoon phase comes. And let's say we break up, okay? Well, we just don't all, let's say right here, we break up with a person, okay? Well, we don't all of a sudden just stop caring or having those loving feelings. No, they take a while to extinguish, okay? And then let's say you don't see the person for 2-3 months. They're no longer around. But then all of a sudden you're walking into Bash's or a local grocery store and you see him And for some reason, even it might be a short period, you go, gosh, why did I ever break up with him or her? They're sure looking good. Gosh, I sure miss them. That's called spontaneous recovery of a conditioned learned response. I know it doesn't sound as romantic as we'd hope, but that's really is what happening when we all of a sudden go and see an ex that we hadn't seen for a long time, and all those positive emotions start coming in, and we start thinking, oh, maybe I should get back with them. I hope you remember this lecture, that this is just a spontaneously recovered associative learning process. It will go away. But if it was a bad relationship, it's a bad idea to go with this spontaneous recovery. Okay, just a little bit of relationship advice. All right. So this is the process of classical conditioning. Key points is for an association to be maintained. These two have to be paired at least some of the time with each other. And then if it is extinguished and there's a rest period, and then you're re-exposed to the conditioned stimulus, you'll have this slight spontaneous recovery. But I hope that you just kind of quickly extinguish that as well, especially if it's a bad habit or something like that. So that's the process of classical conditioning, okay? All right. The next type of conditioning is what we call operant conditioning, okay? This is when we have an event occur, a stimulus in the environment. We have a response from the organism, okay? And if it's reinforced, this increases the probability the behavior will occur in the future, okay? This is also another term is reward, okay? If it's rewarded, I won't spell it all the way out, you get it, rewarded, reinforced, rewarded are kind of used interchangeably, okay? If the behavior is punished, that reduces the probability of behavior in the future, okay? Now, this is where it starts to get sticky, so I want to make sure everybody understands this. Punishment is not always an emotionally negative event, okay? Reinforcement is not always a positive feeling event, okay? So when you think about punishment, it's not just spanking, okay? When you think about reinforcement, it's not just about praise and giving a piece of candy, okay? The term reinforcement simply means that in the future, the probability of that behavior increasing is the likelihood. In this term, the term punishment simply means that the probability of that behavior in the future will be reduced, okay? Now, the other thing that is gets confused is the term positive and negative do not denote valence or emotionality, okay? And I want to make sure everyone is clear on this. Positive and negative do not have an emotional quality. Positive simply means that we're going to add something to the situation that, in this case, if it's a reinforcement, will increase the probability of the behavior, okay? Positive punishment means that we add something to the situation that will reduce the probability of the behavior in the future, okay? Again, it's not about emotions, it's about adding something. So positive reinforcement would be adding a piece of chocolate, adding positive praise, adding something like that. Positive punishment would be adding yelling at a child, as an example. I don't like it very much, but positive punishment can be adding spanking. So child does something wrong, you add something that then reduces the probability of the behavior in the future, okay? Negative means that we're going to take something away, okay? Meaning that we're going to take something away that in the reinforcement will increase the behavior in the future. In punishment, the negative is we're going to take something away that reduces the probability of the behavior in the future, okay? So an example, probably the best example I can come up with this is a child's tantrum behavior, okay? So child is in the grocery store. Let's go with mom, and the child starts screaming, okay? So the child starts acting out. I want a candy bar. 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 Okay. Whoops. And starts really, really acting out. Okay. The mom gives the kid a candy bar. Okay. Now, what has happened in this situation is that the child has been positively reinforced for their tantrum behavior. Mom has been negatively reinforced. So let me go back to the child. The child was positive because mom added something to the situation. She gave the child a candy bar. Okay. So that's going to increase the probability the child will have a tantrum in the future. Okay. Mom is negatively reinforced. So mom does a behavior, gives the child a chocolate. The child stops screaming. Okay. Something is taken away, which is reinforcing to the mom. Okay. Which means in the future, mom will probably give the child a candy bar in the future. Okay. Now, this is where we should have a conversation about where operant and classical conditioning take place in the brain. Okay. If you remember back when we were talking about biology and we talked about memory and memory formations and the reward systems, they sat in the limbic area of the brain. The limbic area is mainly unconscious and it's out of our awareness. Our awareness happens in that higher cortical area. Okay. Operant and classical conditioning largely take place in the limbic system. Okay. So mom rationalizes why she gave the kid and says the kid's out of control. And the child rationalizes, hey, I got a candy bar out of mom. But really, the behavior itself is being programmed at the lower limbic area of the brain that are going to motivate the child and the mom to do that behavior again in the future. Okay. And I could give an example. Training a child not to throw a tantrum. We can train the child, but then if we record the mom's behavior in the grocery store, so the child's no longer, we condition the child not to throw a tantrum anymore. What we find is that the mother will actually go by the candy aisle 4 to 5 times more if the child does not throw a tantrum. In essence, trying to encourage that tantrum behavior unconsciously. They will scoot closer to the aisles that have that candy bar their child wanted. They'll get in the line that has that candy bar that the child wanted in the past. And so what we have learned about tantrum behavior is that we actually have to counter condition both the mother, in this case, or the primary caregiver or whoever, and the child. They both have to go through training. They all both have to go through what's called counter conditioning in order to stop tantrum behavior. Okay. The other reason why I like using the tantrum behavior example is there's classical conditioning that's going on as well. Okay. Because a lot of children who throw tantrums do it very specifically. So there'll be children who, for some reason, will throw a tantrum in bashes, but they don't do it at Circle K. They throw tantrums with mom and dad, but they don't throw tantrums with grandma and grandpa, okay? Those examples are examples of classical conditioning, where the child and the parents have associated the place and the people with the reinforcing behavior, okay? So that's an example of classical conditioning, okay? All right, the other thing that we need to discuss before we go on with this is the level of reinforcement and punishment, okay? Because if the reinforcement or punisher does not equal the behavior that was committed, the reinforcer or punisher won't work. Meaning if you over reinforce, if you over reward, or you under reward, that's not going to increase the probability of behavior. The same thing with punishment is if the punishment doesn't equal quote unquote the crime, the punishment won't be effective. So I go back to the example of spanking. Okay. A lot of parents swear to spanking and they think that it works. But if we actually measure the child's behavior for, let's say the child is spanked for stealing a cookie out of the cookie jar, okay? This would be an example of over punishment, meaning that theoretically it's not going to be effective. And what we have found is that it's not effective because what happens in this situation is the association the child is making isn't that they shouldn't be eating cookies or stealing the cookies. It's that they shouldn't be stealing the cookies in something that is associated with fear and pain, which is apparent. Because when that punishment was created, it was out of congruence with the action, okay? And so what the child is learning in that situation is the fear of the parent not taking a cookie. And what we find out by measuring behaviors is kids will still take the cookie, they just don't do it in front of mom and dad. Okay, so this is an example. So when would be spanking appropriate theoretically? Only when that child committed an act that is equivalent to physical pain. Okay, I want you to think about that again. The only time a physical punishment will work is if the behavior the child committed was equal to the physical pain that is going to be given to the child. Otherwise, the child is learning the association between a spanking and a parent, and they fear a parent, but the behavior will not extinguish. Okay. So that also means, so with cookie stealing, you shouldn't, it should be equivalent to that. So it might be something like taking something positive away or something like that. But that's just an example. And so some key aspects I want everybody to keep in mind. Positive means that we're going to add something to the situation. Negative means we're going to take away from the situation. And the reinforcer or the punisher has to be equal to the behavior. And I could go to the reinforcement part too, okay? If you over reinforce or under reinforce. So if you overpraise a child, that's not going to increase the chances of doing that behavior in the future. So for example, every day I go without swearing, I get to have my favorite pizza and a piece of cake, okay? That's not going to change my swearing behavior. It'll probably just make me sick of my favorite foods. Okay, but it won't change swearing behavior. Again, but if you under reinforce something, so when you don't give some reinforcement for a behavior, it doesn't have the same effect. So if you're a parent or if you're training your boyfriend and girlfriend, look at the behaviors you're wanting out of them and come up with a list of reinforcements and punishments that would match that given thing that you're looking for, okay? I do want to stop here and I just want to ask, does anybody, Alexis, yes, quality over quantity, very good. Yes, thank you for bringing that up. What about something like smoking? Okay, Mercedes, that's a very good question. So we're thinking about, stopping smoking, right? So and just I like that example because of all the addictive substances. Cigarette smoking is one of the hardest to stop. Okay, it's harder than stopping alcohol, and it's actually harder than stopping things like methamphetamine and those types of drugs. Okay, and that's an excellent example because it's a very difficult behavior to commit. But most people who are successful at stopping smoking is they have a dual route. Okay, they set up some type of punishment when they do smoke. Okay, so usually it's a negative punishment, so they won't you know um, they'll take something positive away. Okay, so they won't allow themselves to do something, but they'll use a reinforcement for each day that they don't smoke or they don't do that. The difficulty about smoking is that there's so many things that you have to counter condition. Okay. So when we're talking about someone who's smoking, we have to extinguish the response to the smell of cigarette smoke. We have to extinguish the response to the different location the smokers were at. Um, one of the people that I know who's been very successful at stopping smoking said the biggest place that she had to extinguish her smoking behavior was in the car. Okay, so she absolutely could not have any cigarettes anywhere close whenever she was driving for a few years. But she'll even admit when still today, when that smoke comes through the window, she'll start to get a small craving. Okay. And that's the difficulty when we're dealing with smoking and other addictive behaviors, is you have to counter condition not only not smoking, but you have to extinguish all of those things that have been classically conditioned. Does that make sense, Mercedes?
Yes, it does. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Okay. I do want to ask, does anybody have any questions about the difference between reinforcement and punishment, the difference between positive and negative? I just want to make sure everybody has this down before we move on. Okay. All right, hearing none, I just want to go over a couple more examples. So this is an example of positive reinforcement versus negative reinforcement, okay? You turn in your homework on time, the teacher praises you for your performance. So something was added, okay? Which should increase turning in your homework on time in the future. In the negative example, you turn your homework in on time, teacher stops criticizing you for late work. So something is taken away, which is reinforcing, such as criticism, which should increase turning in your homework in the future, okay? And these are just some examples. The last one, randomly pressing a button on the dashboard of a friend's car. A really good song turns on, so you deliberately press the same thing in the future. In the negative reinforcement thing is you randomly press a button in the dashboard of your friend's car. That annoying song they're always playing shuts off. That's reinforcing. So next time you hear that, something was taken away. In this case, something was added, good music. In this case, something was taken away, bad music, and that increased that button pushing in the future, okay? So this is kind of that example between positive and negative. One we're adding, the other we're taking away, okay? Let's go to, and this is just some example right here is an example between positive punishment and negative punishment. You don't clean up your room when your parents ask you to. Your parents yell at you for not cleaning your room. You stop dawdling and clean up your room, okay? all right? So you decreased not cleaning behavior, but you added something to it, the parents yelling. So yelling was added, okay? In the negative situation, you come home 2 hours late. You get grounded for 2 weeks. So something negative was something positive was taken away, your freedom. Okay, think about this in this situation. Your freedom was taken away because now you're grounded. Yeah, you'll probably not be late again. You decrease the chance that they'll be late in the future. Okay. Now, I want to just talk about one rule to these things because a lot of people ask, you know, what does it mean when why doesn't this always work? Well, you know, I know a lot of parents who put up the reward charts and they go through, okay, guys, this is what will happen if you don't listen to me, those types of things. And the child still acts out or still doesn't do what they want to do. Okay. Well, if you're training somebody, the issue with using these techniques on humans is once you give the element of choice, these are less effective. Reinforcement and punishment are less effective. Okay. And probably my favorite example of this is a kid's, a kid is out late. Mom said, hey, be home by midnight. Now, I want you to imagine this. Mom says, be home by midnight, or I'm going to take your Xbox away. Okay. And I want you to think about this in the adolescent mind. Let's say it's getting near midnight. Maybe, he needed to leave by 11:45. It's 15 minutes to get home. But at 11:30, he's doing really, really good on it, on this game. Let's say he's a guy and there's this girl over here that's paying really close attention to him. And he's drinking this stuff out of this cup that makes him feel real funny. And he's having just a grand old time. Okay. Element of choice there in the moment. Is he going to go home or is he going to stay out past curfew? Most likely, because of the current stimuli in the environment, he's probably going to be late for curfew. And he comes in, mom takes away the Xbox, but again, the next weekend he's caught in that same situation and he's more likely to do it again. Okay. And a lot of parents get frustrated. Why didn't it work? Okay. Again, it's about the element of choice. Okay. So if you're going to use these techniques to their most effectiveness, okay, it's good to have rules. Be home by midnight. But as the parent, have the consequences in the background. If the kids ask, well, what will happen if I'm not home by midnight? Just say, you'll find out. Okay. Because I will tell you on a one trial learning, you could use a positive punishment for the child curfew. And I'll tell you, this usually is one trial learning, and your kid will be on time every time. It takes him 15 minutes to go get home. So at 11:45, we're going to add something to the environment. 11:45 is when he's supposed to leave. 11:46, in your PJs with curlers or ratted hair and everything, and all your night stink, knock on that door. They answer and say, hey, Billy, it's time to go home. All right, I promise you that addition of that negative stimuli, your child will most likely come home on curfew every time after that. So, but remember, again, if you give the element of choice, these techniques are less effective. In some cases, such as addiction recovery, Mercedes' example of smoking, where you have to set up different things for yourself. So it does take more time. It's still effective. But whenever you have the chance to train someone or your animal, remember that whenever you give the element of choice, it's not going to be as effective. Okay. I'll tell you that once upon a time, I used to assign this to students. They had to train some things, whether it be their boyfriend, girlfriend, or their uh, animal, fish, and I've had people train their girlfriends to hug them. I've had people train their fish, their little goldfish, to jump out of their bowl and into another bowl, and it's really interesting to see how you can do these effectively. I always remember, and we'll end with this little story on training real quick. Is a boy and deeply in love with his girlfriend. He just adored her. But the thing he didn't really like is she wasn't much of a hugger. Okay. And so he decided to use a project in one of my classes to see if he can't train hugging behavior in his girlfriend. Okay. And so what he did now, if unless you're one of the sadistic people that like to watch people fall and you like to stand there and laugh at them, most people, when you see somebody trip and stuff, you actually have an automatic response to go and try and catch them. Okay. And so what he did is he set up separate conditions where the girl would slowly end up having to grasp him completely. He would start with a little stumble and she'd put his arm on him, and then they'd walk and he did it variably. So then the next time he would do it again and put his arm, and then he would fall further and she would put her other arm. And then eventually he made it so that the situation is that she had to fully kind of grasp him and stuff like that. And it's interesting. What's interesting about that is the reinforcement that he did was a thing of affection. Thank you, sweetie. Thank you. That kind of reinforcement was an emotional reinforcement. And it's funny because I saw this kid about a year or two after my class that he had with me, and he says she still hugs him, but he doesn't have to trip anymore. She just started coming up and giving him a hug because she figured out that there was going to be a reinforcer for it. There was going to be this moment of affection. And so that's kind of an example of how to use these type of techniques to train your loved ones or your kids or your pets or animals. But it does take patience. You have to train each individual behavior. You can't just get someone, in Mercedes' example, you can't just get someone to stop smoking. You have to train each of those triggered behaviors out of the individual, and it takes time. So, but I'm going to stop for today. We'll wrap up on Monday looking at these what's called schedules of reinforcement, and the different ways to reinforce, and which are better, which are not as good. And then we'll move on to social learning, and then we'll finish up with this section. Does anybody have any questions for today? All right, hearing none and seeing Heidi's thumb up, let's go ahead and get out of here. And like there will be, I will post probably earlier tomorrow, a little short 5-question quiz over the stuff we've been going over. Again, I don't want you to worry about those. We'll even out the scores in the end. It's more to let me know that you guys are learning and understanding what we're doing here. So I don't want you to panic over them, but I do want you to do them so I know where I need to do a better job in helping educate you guys. So, but the scores themselves will curve them and all that kind of stuff in the end. So please do those, and I'll get them posted tomorrow. They'll be due like next Wednesday. Okay. Have a wonderful rest of your week. And we will see you all on Monday. You too, Mercedes. Thank you.